So let's get started with this parallel session on the contributions that nature-based solutions can make to our post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And Linda, let me know if there's any issues with the slides. Sharing them now. Now, most of you will have been in the plenary this morning, the opening session for this annual event in NetworkNature. And of course, you know, pre-COVID, how we would have seen this event is all of us probably together, you know, and in this parallel session, we'd be a physical breakout room, you know, we'd go off to the side specifically to discuss this topic. So we're hoping to try and get a little bit of that atmosphere today. So starting with our introductions and objectives, I first wanted to introduce myself as well as the organization I represent. So my name is Daisy Hessenberger. I've been working now with IUCN for 3 years, specifically on the topic of nature-based solutions, leading the development and collaboration, the consultation on the IUCN Global Standard for nature-based solutions. Now, some of you may be familiar with IUCN. I know for a fact that one of the people or a couple of people on the call work directly with IUCN. But we are the world's largest environmental network. And how we're really composed is that we're a membership, we're a union, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And we represent over 1,000, so 1,300 member organizations, which includes state governments, many of your own governments. It includes non-governmental organizations, and it includes indigenous peoples organizations. And the reason we represent them is really to realize direct benefits to people and nature. How do we attain the SDGs? How do we meet other global challenges? And how do we have a real policy impact? That's the part we're going to concentrate on today. And the way that we do that, the how behind it, the gears that keep this organization moving, are our Secretariat there in the middle with over 900 staff in different countries, 50 countries around the world, and 10,000 experts in different commissions, which represent our scientific expertise, which we feed back to our member organizations, along with our experience with local communities being in fact impacted by some of these global challenges. The reason I wanted to show you this today is in a time where we get more and more information handed to us, it's very important to know where that information is coming from. I'm speaking to you from the global component of IUCN, but you heard from my colleague Chantal, who represents she's the acting director of our European office in Brussels. And together we co-lead with Iucn on the NetworkNature project. So before we go into introducing yourselves, it's very important that we all set the bar on how we're going to treat each other in this session. In every single IUCN event, whether it's virtual, whether it's in person, like the IUCN Congress that just happened, we have an anti-harassment policy because we're very strict on providing a professional, respectful, and harassment-free space. Also because we believe that the only way that we can capitalize on the innovation, on the lessons learned, on social learning is for everyone to feel that they are working in a safe space, but also to encourage safe conflict, to encourage disagreement in a way that is respectful to all. So it applies to myself as well as all the participants. You're expected to conduct yourself in a professional, respectful, and responsible manner. And the main thing I want you to take from this slide beyond that is that if you're even unsure about something happens, if there's a comment that made you uncomfortable, if you have a criticism against any of the facilitators, please do get in touch. There's an email there's a number, but you're also welcome to send me or my colleague Linda, who's our technical aide today and our rapporteur, just a question, you know, asking and checking in, and no action will be taken until we've further discussed it with you. So with that out of the way, what are we actually here to do in the next 2 hours? It's very valuable, the next 2 hours of your time. And like I said, we're going to spend a bit of time on introductions. We've introduced ourselves. We're going to introduce you soon through a Menti. And then we will be introducing nature-based solutions in a little bit more depth, and specifically the IUCN Global Standard, and why having a solid definition and global framework is important when we're talking about global policy contributions. We will then be having a panel on the policy aspect, looking at, what contributions can be had to the global policy, what's already been done, and what can we do towards mainstreaming nature-based solutions, and then closing with some interactive activities as well on what can we do going forward, what are the opportunities there. So with that in mind, I think we're just going to go for our first Mentimeter. My colleague Linda is going to put the link in the chat, and let me just bring up some of those results. There it is. So we already heard from many of you in the plenary this morning about, what stakeholder group you were representing, but we'd love to hear today, and the voting is closed. What organization are you representing? It could be more than one, but if you can just put your title, if it's Iucn, if it's a city, you might have one foot in one camp and another foot in another camp. Please do sign into Menti. The link is in the chat, as well as the code at the top there. You can go to www.menti.com and use the code 40366712. It's saying the link is not working. Let me just, oh, no, it is working, okay. Let me just make sure that that's the right link, because some people have access issues. 1 second. That should be the right link. Okay, great. Oh, thank God we have Youth for Nature in the room. A very important component of our just transition to a carbon neutral world are youth, because they really hold the key to sustainability beyond generations that are currently alive. And Youth for Nature is an organization we work with quite a bit. OPLA, that'll be John out there. Hi, John. OPLA is one of our other partners on the NetworkNature policy. CINEA, we heard from them this morning. EFI is the European Forest Institute. We've got some local governance in here. We have some researchers from INRAE, political science. So a good mix of research. Bonjour to the Graduate Institute in Geneva. They're just down the lake from here. Our global headquarters are in Lausanne. So welcome. And someone also joining us from Iucn and an EU agency. So we have a good mix of decision makers, policy experts, as well as the local, the researcher side of things. So next question. You can still join on the Menti, just please go in the chat. This is just for us to know where you're joining us from today. What kind of country, what kind of geography we have in the room. Because it's very easy to identify ourselves as, by our jobs. But what this lets us know is also your local ecosystems and some of the nature-based solutions you might be benefiting from in France, in Stockholm, Finland. We had a comment this morning in the plenary that it was difficult to convince specifically engineers in more Nordic countries because of this understanding that nature-based solutions cannot be as helpful when it's very cold. So there's a lot of, and the word this morning, I think the two words we heard from the plenary was that ignorance was a barrier to nature-based solutions, but that there's also still hope. London, wonderful. Well, London has some very good greening mechanisms, as does and good to have the city of Manchester represented here as well. And someone else also from Switzerland, Zurich. Good to see. Wonderful. Okay. And then also for us to get an idea of who we're learning from in the room, different type of diversity, sorry. How many years experience you have in any of your fields that can be counting specifically to nature-based solutions? If you are a policy officer, how many years in policy? In your current position, how many years of experience do we have? And again, the reason we ask for this is to make visible the wealth of knowledge that we have in the workshop, because a key way for us to learn about nature-based solutions and their policy contributions is to respect and learn with each other from the wisdom that we have. So from those who are from the older generations, the older years of experience, really learning from what worked or didn't work in the past, and also from the younger generations, taking into account that intergenerational approach and passion that they hold. And novel perspective as well. Okay, I'll give you 3 more seconds, and then we just have one more question. Okay. This is for me to be able to gauge how to present on nature-based solutions in the standard. So if you haven't yet voted in the Menti, please answer this question. I need to know at what bar to set the presentation, the terminology, and vocab at. If really nature-based solutions is a word that, when people say it, you feel a bit guilty because you don't have a grasp of it. There's no shame in saying I don't understand them at all. They're very complex, and I always consider myself learning and improving. So there are people who've heard of it once or twice, so perhaps don't have a full grasp, but a good amount of you that understand it pretty well. But we'll make sure that we cover the basics, and there'll be, thank you very much for the person admitting I don't understand them at all. Like I said, they're very complex, and I still run into some that are new to me as well. A couple more seconds. Okay, let's call it a day there. So from the agenda, we're now going to have a getting on the same page presentation. And do feel free to use the chat. You can put questions in there. You can also introduce yourselves, post your own projects and links, your own publications. Feel free to use it. Just be mindful that especially during the panel to be a bit quieter on there because it can be distracting to our panelists. So let's go on then with getting on the same page for nature-based solutions. Now, the reason this is important is because there are some different views for sure on what nature-based solutions are and how they operate. And in order for us to really, in 2 hours, which is really a short amount of time, to be able to jump to, identifying opportunities and challenges linked to the post-2020 framework, we need to at least start on a common basis and say, okay, for the purposes of this session, this is the definition we're accepting. And then I will present the standard as a key tool, one of the ways in which we can realize our policy ambitions and touch upon the links to the post-2020 framework. So this morning, I talked about the potential that nature-based solutions have to address our societal challenges. We have a framework that we use at Iucn for climate change mitigation and adaptation, that nature-based solutions can address disaster risk reduction, economic and social development, human health, food security, water security, and of course, ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. And the reason that we always have this slide first is because at their heart, nature-based solutions are about addressing societal challenges, very human needs. Nature is very resilient and will do fine without us. And when you think about nature-based solutions, one thing we want you to keep an eye on is that this is not replacing conservation action, but rather it's a different perspective on conservation action. It is about an additional pillar to be able to access further finance, an additional pillar to be able to talk to new communities such as landscape architects or landowners. And so safeguarding nature, which you can think of as more the traditional conventional approaches to conservation, is still important. Safeguarding society, which is, like I said, nature-based solutions start with very societal challenges. It pivots us around to be able to address a similar issue, biodiversity loss, but from a very different place where we also balance the trade-offs with human well-being benefits. The similarities between these two approaches is that both ultimately rest upon conservation norms and science, and both of them do extend conservation's reach and relevance. Now, whether you're new to NBS, whether you consider yourself an expert, one thing we all have to admit is that they are absolutely gaining momentum worldwide. With the COP coming up in a couple of weeks, we've heard nature-based solutions, we've seen them on the news, we've seen businesses start whole nature-based solutions teams, we're seeing investors calling for bankable nature-based solutions. The amount of noise that's out there around nature-based solutions is huge. And there's good reason for that. They didn't come out of the thin air. They were built upon very early IUCN origins on different approaches like ecosystem-based adaptation or forest landscape restoration. And then as research built up around them, as more and more decision makers started to incorporate them, the next sort of milestone there was in 2016, a formalized definition by IUCN. And what that means when we say there's an IUCN definition, that's not just an organization putting some words down. It means that our membership adopts that definition. And we have, I think it's 159 state members currently. So at the time, over 100 state members adopting this definition. So with that, the growth around nature-based solutions took off rapidly. And a big component of that was an awesome commitment from the EU. And I believe actually that number is out of date for 2017. I think EU Horizon 2020 has now invested over 200 million into nature-based solutions. So we started seeing more and more projects on the ground. And leading to then in 2020, the IUCN Global Standard being adopted by the IUCN Council and members and operationalized. And so now we stand on this precipice, if you will, at the edge of a cliff, where we see, the things that could go wrong in our society, but we also see the huge amount of power, the amount of people investing into nature-based solutions, both time and money, research and decisions. But what are they really beyond this noise, beyond, these very many research papers out there, all of these businesses getting involved and calling for nature-based solutions, putting them on their websites? It is astoundingly important that we understand the definition. And I hinted at this in my morning plenary session, which is that without a global definition, we run the risk of misidentifying solutions, which some, it might be easy to say, well, is that bad as long as all the solutions are good? But like I said, you water down the evidence base and you sort of hobble the business case if you include other approaches in that nature-based solutions portfolio. And so we have a very simple typology to sort of separate out different solutions that are involved with nature, because the truth is, with these awesome challenges we face, we need all the solutions we can get. Absolutely all of them. Nature-based solutions do not replace de-investing from fossil fuels. They do not say we can't use other approaches and rely on technology, AI. Nature-based solutions are just another way for us to address our challenges, and a very important one, because the health of our planet hinges on them. So we separate them out into nature-inspired solutions. This is biomimicry. Some of you will recognize the word, where you are inspired by nature. It could be things like if you were building some coastal defense walls, you might want to look at the structure of coral reefs to inspire the actual infrastructure, gray infrastructure that you put along the coast. Nature-derived solutions are an absolutely important part of our just transition. This is things like renewable energy, biofuels, tidal energy, wind energy. And this is where you take the resource from nature, like wind energy, where wind is a natural product, but you're not by definition supporting the underlying ecosystems. You might put in those windmills, but not necessarily support the ecosystem that gives you that natural resource. So again, we absolutely need investment into renewable energy, but it's not necessarily a nature-based solution, which ultimately is about working with people and with your underlying nature. And so I'm really glad to introduce you to the IUCN definition. I've read this so many times, and each time I find different aspects to it and really find it's the shortest sentence for me that captures everything that nature-based solutions are. And we were going to pick it out apart so we fully understand it and can move on to the important thing in the plenary, which is the parallel, the link to the policy. So IUCN defines nature-based solutions as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So what does that really mean? Well, they're actions, they're things that happen on the ground, and they can either be protection, restoration, or sustainable management. That doesn't mean they can't be mixes of it. Forest landscape restoration well, it's in the title, they always involve restoration, but forests are, ecosystems which we, for example, energy from in terms of firewood. So they're also sustainably managed. You might have a protected area, which also has a sustainable management aspect. But we use this sort of action to separate out things from, for example, such as a seawall, where you might build a wall to protect people from wave damage, but you're not protecting or restoring or managing your nature. Saying that, because we increasingly work in larger complex landscapes, what could be one of these actions is that landscape approach where you're protecting some nature, restoring some, and it includes a seawall. So a very important aspect of nature-based solutions is that they can be a mix of green and gray. There are some outliers. This is a simplistic approach of the things that can happen on the ground, but included in nature-based solutions, or what I like to call nature-based solutions enabling actions, are policy frameworks, finance mechanisms, other technology, working with small, medium enterprises. So they might not be your stereotypical nature-based solutions on the ground, but they're absolutely parts of a larger nature-based solution often. Now, another part in our definition is natural or modified ecosystems. And we have to say this because the percentages of our land on a global level that are actually natural, if you will say, or ecologically intact, are anything between predictions of only 2 to 3% to 20 to 40%. So at the very least, more than a half of our planet is a modified ecosystem. And so we're not talking about working in pristine, tropical forests or in Antarctica. We can work in those places with nature-based solutions, but we're also talking about cities, urban situations, fields, global infrastructure, very modified landscapes. And the next part of the definition is that they address societal challenges. I won't spend too much time here beyond saying that we've mapped against the SDGs, and I'll introduce you to which of the targets of the Post-2020 framework are nature-based solutions are relevant. And they do so effectively adaptively. And this is often sort of at the end of the definition, not fully taken on board. So I wanted to show you a picture of my grandmother. She's 96 years old, living in Vienna. But one of my colleagues, Ali Razarivsi, he is all about mangrove forests. He loves what they can do to protect people, to reduce the risk of damage to infrastructure. And in every single one of his presentations where he talks about the potential of mangrove forests globally to mitigate our climate, to help with adaptation to climate change, he also brings up the story of, well, at the end of the day, they have to work. They have to be effective because the town on the other side of your mangrove forest where that flooding might occur, if your grandmother was there, what would you want? Would you want that seawall? Would you want that mangrove forest? Would you want something in between? At the end of the day, you're protecting real people in these places. And so they have to be effective, and more so, they have to be cost effective. And adaptive, well, I think we've had that proven to us with this pandemic. We've got a huge amount of science and experience and knowledge about nature-based solutions, even though the term is new, the approaches that fall underneath the umbrella are not. But our world is constantly changing, so they have to be managed in a way that we can respond to things like a global pandemic. And they have to provide human well-being and biodiversity benefits. So this is not just about bringing down temperature in cities to help human health. They also have to provide that biodiversity benefit. So biodiversity is really at the heart of nature-based solutions. Now, before we head on, I just wanted to emphasize nature-based solutions, while the wording is relatively new, let's say in the last, I think, 14 years, nature-based solutions are an umbrella approach under which fall communities of practice that have decades worth of experience. So within there is green engineering, natural infrastructure, ecosystem-based management, forest landscape restoration, ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, and plenty of other approaches that perhaps don't have these labels, but nature-based solutions gathers all of these approaches, all of them that benefit people and nature, so that we can actually get a greater momentum, a greater impact, and break down some of these siloed communities of practice. Okay, so I just want to stop for 1 second and see if there are any questions before I move on to the standard. We have a small enough group. If you have any questions, you can just unmute, introduce your name and organization and ask away. Otherwise, we'll move on to the standard. Here we go. So Julia Beth, she's asking, from IUCN's perspective, what is the difference between nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation? I'm glad you asked that, because we get variations of this question. We get, what's the difference between nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions? What's the difference between nature-based solutions and forest landscape restoration? And so nature, I always like that Venn diagram. It's a bit like this. A lot of ecosystem-based adaptation is likely a nature-based solution, but some, depending on what framework you're using, your operations of best practice, might not qualify or might not be a strong nature-based solution, so I'll say. The ecosystem-based adaptation is a little bit of an exception. So with other approaches, that Venn diagram might be a bit more separate. Maybe only a few or half could be considered nature-based solutions. In things like renewable energy, we're still looking into that to see if any could be considered a nature-based solutions. Ecosystem-based adaptation, as one of the communities with some of the most knowledge and expertise going back through time. And we've mapped the standard to quite a few different approaches, including the EBA guidelines, likely are mostly nature-based solutions for adaptation, but they're not equal and the same. I also have another question from Joanna, thank you, from INRAE. Where does the distinction between nature-based, nature-derived, and nature-inspired solutions come from? Does it answer a specific actor's demand? So we'll hear when I touch upon the standard how it was developed. And in that process, we consulted through a series of about 4 or 5, maybe 6 drafts of the standard. We did global consultations with over 1,000 people from 100 countries. And in that, some of the questions kept repeating themselves, especially, is renewable energy a nature-based solution? Is biofuels a nature-based solution? Is wind energy a nature-based solution? And at the same time, there are different definitions for nature-based solutions out of there, and some of them do include biomimicry. And while biomimicry can be part of a larger nature-based solution, unless it also supports the underlying ecosystem, it's not nature-based. So we came up with that framework to answer those questions in something that was more simplistic than the standard. And to be honest, we came up with it for presentations such as these, but it resonated so strongly with our as something that was easy to comprehend very quickly, and also not judgmental. This was not about saying, we can't have nature-inspired solutions, or we don't want nature, we don't want nature-derived solutions. So we actually built up this typology into all of our presentations on nature-based solutions, and it comes up in the IUCN Global Standard as part of the guidance. So I hope I answered your question, Julia. I see that you asked it because many of the people you're talking to are always wondering what's the difference between the two and why nature-based solution was put forward as a concept, either in relation to these typologies, but also in terms of EBA. One other thing I note before I go on to the standard is that you'll note that I said ecosystem-based adaptation could be nature-based solutions, and if they are, and they often are, for adaptation. But if we go back to the societal challenges, not all nature-based solutions are aimed at adaptation. We hear about nature-based solutions in the climate most, I think, in the media, but nature-based solutions offer huge potential for food security. We see a big amount of the work going into ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. We see it for water security, pure economic development. So EBA is, and nature-based solutions for climate are only a part of what nature offers as a potential for our societal challenges. And again, going back to the umbrella, NBS does not ever replace EBA. EBA is a community of practice that goes forward, but nature-based solutions brings EBA under that umbrella so that we can start running meta-analyses that take into account the cost effectiveness, not just of EBA, but including other approaches like ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction and so on. And perhaps during the policy panel, my colleague Veronica Ruiz, who's on that panel, can help talk about why in policy it's important for their things to be brought under one umbrella rather than siloed into different approaches. Okay, I'd like to move on to the standard, and then we're going to send you off into some group work amongst yourselves. So let me bring up my screen again. So the standard. I won't go into why we need it because I touched upon that this morning. It's there to move from pilots to identify strong nature-based solutions so that we can scale them up to answer questions such as we've just heard on what falls under the umbrella of nature-based solutions. But I wanted to take a step back from the booklet and the assessment part and certification and really introduce you to the backbone of the standard, which is these 8 criteria. This was developed from principles, more scientific principles. This was developed by consultation with a lot of stakeholders to formalize into these 8 principles for the operationalization of nature-based solutions. So starting with 1 at their heart, nature-based solutions are all about societal challenges. My grandmother, whose photo I showed, when she asks what I work on, I tell her that it's about actions which answer very human needs. This is about working with nature, but for humankind, even though nature and humans are you can't separate nature and humans. Then number 2, design at scale. Nature-based solutions must be designed looking outside of their boundaries. Now, that doesn't mean that every nature-based solution has to be massive and cover a whole city or an entire coastline, although we'd love to see more of those. Nature-based solutions, the area of action, the area of implementation, if you will, can still be quite small. It can be part of a freshwater habitat, for example. But if you design it, it has to look at what's happening up and downstream and in the surrounding landscape. What risks are being brought from upstream that could impact your intervention? How could your actions in the nature-based solutions affect those downstream from you? And then what are these actions actually built out of? They're built out of the resources of sustainable development, the 3 pillars of sustainable development, which are nature, economy, and society. So nature-based solutions are built upon the principle of biodiversity net gain. They're built out of economic viability, and also they are governed inclusively. So it's using that society, economy, and environment nexus. And that sounds great. We'd love to benefit people, make money, and benefit biodiversity in the same go, feeding 2 birds with 1 stone, 1 seed. But the truth is that triple win scenarios don't just happen like that. And so we have to actively balance trade-offs. Who has to pay today for us all to win in the future? Perhaps it's not about maximizing biodiversity, but balancing the net gain. It's always in the gain side of things, the positive side. It's balancing that with economic viability. And finally, like I said, because we don't know everything, we can't predict the future, nature-based solutions are adaptively managed, especially in the face of climate change predictions, which are, along a certain scale. They have to be monitored and learned from throughout their implementation period. And finally, nature-based solutions have to be mainstreamed for sustainability. We cannot afford to take a project approach where we go in, work with an ecosystem, get the buy-in of people for 3 years, because that's how long our funding lasts, and then leave that ecosystem, leave that community, sometimes then leaving them worse off than when we found them. So that's really the skeleton of the standard. But it's much more than that, of course. That sounds very theoretical and nice, but really what else is in this booklet, Daisy? So there is the standard itself, which gives you a bit more guidance on the criteria and has some nice examples in it. If that's all you've got time to read, I'd point you towards that. And then there's a really lengthy guidance booklet that goes into the science behind it. But what I wanted to show you, also mention, is the self-assessment tool that accompanies the standard. So this is what we've been using to assess interventions to say whether they're in adherence with the standard, but also whether they're strong, adequate, or partial. allowing the people we work with to identify weaknesses which they can improve upon, but also allowing them to identify strengths. This is just an example quickly of what the standard really looks like in a more technical aspect. They're made up of criteria, which are made up of a subset of indicators that you can rate along the scale and sort of guidance on how to do that rating. And overall, that gives you an output of whether you're in adherence or not. Specifically, in terms of the output, you have to be at least partially addressing each criterion because they're all equally important in this first iteration of the standard. So even if you're insufficient or red on even one, you're not in adherence with the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. Doesn't mean you're not a nature-based solutions. To be clear, it's very specific wording. This is about adherence to a standard because the standard was designed to be facilitative. This is not about saying, oh, that community over there, you can never be a nature-based solutions. This is about starting conversations with new sectors to say, well, look, you're a partial nature-based solutions, and how can we build that up to strong? And how can we make that valuable and see the added benefits for you to make this part of your business as usual? So it's a much more inclusive approach. And again, that strategy came out of these consultations. Stakeholders were very adamant. They did not need something that safeguarded the term so strictly that it actually stopped innovation and stopped partnership between sectors. So I think I've hopefully shown you how the standard can be part of, using or realizing the potential of nature-based solution. But today is about policy. So part of that, how do we scale up nature-based solutions is specific to policy alignment to make sure the action we're taking is sustained. That links to the standard nicely on criterion 8, which is all about sustainability and mainstreaming, specifically with policy. We have a couple of slides on the policy framework, but I think we're going to touch upon them in the panel, so I won't skip ahead to those. Instead, we'll stop here for any questions on the standard and then move on to a little bit of group work before we dive into the policy component. There's a question from David Benjamin on, is there a technical advisory committee that will revise the standard ongoing, and is this open source? So absolutely. First of all, the standard is open to download, as is the guidance, by anyone on the IUCN library, and we'll put a link in the chat. It's also available in at least 6 languages, I think more now, so the Spanish, French, Mandarin, an unofficial version in Arabic, Albanian, and Japanese, I believe, as well. So we're adding as many languages as we can with the resources that we have. But in terms of a technical advisory group, that's a very excellent question. You may have heard me say this is the first iteration of the standard. So every 4 years, the standard will be revised, really to reflect the demands of the community. The standard that we've designed now is the standard that we need now. In 4 years' time, we might need something that is less facilitative, more safeguarding the term, or some of the criteria. I don't expect a criteria level change, but some of the indicators might also be altered in every 4 years. That is the responsibility of the International Standards Committee, which is made up of representatives of regions globally, as well as representatives of different sectors. So there's indigenous peoples there, business on there, there's governments. And that standards committee is actually being launched at COP on the 10th of November. So keep an eye out for that if you're following COP in November. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can move on to a bit of group work. I see Benjamin commenting that the revision process could be enhanced by a global community and should be open source like scientific journal papers. The first iteration of the standard, we followed ICEAL guidelines. So we ran 2 completely open global consultations after an internal consultation with our over 1,400 members. So we reached 1,000 people, more than 1,000 people in 100 countries. We ran in-person workshops, but it was all available online in a survey. I'm not sure how future iterations and revisions will be done, but I do know that if you're part of the IUCN user group, which anybody can sign up to, and we'll put the link in the chat, if you use the standard, that is feedback that we can take on board. So we encourage as much use and communication on this topic. Brilliant. So yeah, we absolutely, the standard has to be revised to fit your needs. So the more we hear from you and communities of practice, the better. So I think let's move on to a bit of group work. I'm just going to share my screen before we do and skip ahead a little bit. Show you the group work. So in the group, we're going to give you a chance just to introduce yourselves in smaller groups of 3 or 4. We'd like you to present your link to nature-based solutions. That could be something very tangible, like I'm working on X project doing X, Y, Z. That's the nature-based solutions. But it could also be, well, I work on this and I'm not sure about the link to nature-based solutions, but I see it in, you know, my client's demand for more green business, for example. And then we have a mural to be able to map these so we can come out with this expertise. So if you can just pop into the mural while you're talking, which regions you're representing in your nature-based solutions, what ecosystems come up in terms of expertise, what societal challenges are being addressed. You can term them how you want. You don't have to follow the Iucn typology, and what sector that link to nature-based solutions might be relevant for. But before we go to the mural, we just want to get your brain started for that group work. So if you can head back to Mentimeter, Linda will put the link in the chat to the Menti. So, you know, to do a bit of work with you so that by the time you come into your group work, you've had a little bit of a chance to think about, well, what's the link between my work and nature-based solutions? If you could just write down in the Menti your sort of first response to that. Well, that gives us a time to sort you into these groups.
What's the code again?
Linda, if you could put the code in the chat, the code's at the top, 4036 6712.
All right.
Great. Okay, so someone's taking biodiversity action. Someone's working on EU projects, so we'll have some great projects in there. Management policy, great. So we expect to see some disaster risk reduction, societal challenges. In the chat. Working for designing and funding a riverway pollutant eco machines for parks. Parks are a very important part of our nature-based solutions in cities. Interaction between nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches in the policy side of things. So looking forward to having that discussion during the panel. And from Youth for Nature, the first global youth statement on nature-based solutions, which is delivered at COP26 and COP15. Absolutely, during the panel, please do step up and feel free to speak on that, as well as post that link in the chat. Help develop city-specific natural environment cities. Okay, so let's send you off into your breakout rooms. Before we do, I'm just going to post in the chat a link to a mural. Wonderful. Okay, welcome back. In the last minute, I just want to give a little summary of what we've seen in the Canva. I'm glad it went well with the Canva, because the next one will be a little bit more tricky. We're going to be embedding nature-based solutions into the theory of change for the global biodiversity framework. So there's a map for the next group work after the panel. You're going to see a diagram of the theory of change for the post-2020 framework. And you're going to put in opportunities and also barriers for the different parts of the theory of change. But first of all, we have a real lovely diversity of regions. There's a lot of Europe, but we also see that we have North America there. but mostly a really nice diversity of ecosystems. We saw that this morning as well. What I'm really interested in is that there's quite a good show of the different societal challenges, and I'm really enjoying seeing environmental justice and social equity in there. Flood protection is a really big expertise in Europe, so good to see the water security touched upon, and others working on a more rights-based approach as well. Wonderful. We'll use this as the expertise when we then share a sort of, after your second group work, we'll have this theory of change from the global framework, from the text itself, with these barriers and opportunities for NBS there. And when we report back on that, we'll be able to show, well, this is the expertise that informed that decision. So you can leave Canva. We'll be coming back to Canva, but we'll close it for now, because for now we're gonna, before we comment on the theory of change for the post-2020 global framework, we're gonna have a little panel discussion. This is, we're a small group here, so we can get into some real questions and answers. So first of all, I'm going to introduce my colleague Veronica Ruiz, and then we will hear from Philip Lahea Walter. So Veronica is my colleague in action on nature-based solutions. Her passion is around disaster risk reduction and how nature can contribute towards our more humanitarian challenges. But she's also a co-author like myself on the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions, and we've been working very closely together for the last 3 years on nature-based solutions. And specifically, she's been involved in some of the global processes and attended some of the COPs. So she's just going to present, to set the scene for us on the post-2020 framework. She's just going to show us, where does NBS fit in? So a couple of slides, and then we'll hear from Philip and then have some questions. Great. So Veronica, I'll flip through the slides, but just let me know when to change.
Thank you, Daisy, for the introduction, and hello to everybody for joining today in such an event organized by NetworkNature colleagues. So as Daisy was saying, like nature-based solutions, we are hearing everywhere, not only, as Daisy mentioned at the CBD, the Convention for Biological Diversity, but nature-based solutions is everywhere. And why then we are proposing nature-based solutions as the connector in between the different Rio Convention? Because we believe that a healthy and resilient ecosystem can provide benefit for people, but also for nature. We really need to understand, like, this is indivisible connection in between both components, people and nature. And that's why we believe that nature-based solutions should be included beyond the CBD, but also tackling the SDGs, the 2030 agenda, and the UNCCC with the climate COP, which is happening in 2 weeks. And what about the Ramsar, and especially the certification one, and also the Sendai framework, which is one, like, let's say, like a stay aside. So this is why we are promoting nature-based solutions. So, and what is the work that IUCN has been doing? Next slide. So IUCN, we have been working on nature-based solutions within the framework of this, especially on the Global Biodiversity Framework. Why we have been working on it? Because as you know, there is still a sort of a push, right? Is why are you bringing nature-based solutions? What is different or what we have been doing so far on ecosystem-based approaches? And also why you want to bring nature-based solutions is we have the ecosystem approach very well embedded and adopted by the CBD. I think back in 2000, so 21 years ago. It is important that we bring NBS, so nature-based solutions, on board, also to differentiate both the NBS and the ecosystem approach, because they're completely two different things. The ecosystem approach, as such, provides a conceptual framing, a framing that is strategic in nature, aiming to help reach a balance between the 3 objectives of the Convention for Biological Diversity. But in the other side, we have nature-based solutions, which is more the, let's say, operational way of putting in place the ecosystem approach, and is aiming to make conservation and sustainable management of biodiversity relevant and useful beyond conservation. We need to go beyond our comfort zone, and we really need to work with other sectors. So that's why we are bringing nature-based solutions into the global biodiversity framework. But also it's because we believe that it's a tool that can help implement this new, implement the framework, but also into achieve the targets. Targets in which, as we see now, nature-based solutions are, let's say, non-existent, but they can be reflected in two of the targets that are part of the framework. So we have target number 8, and then we also have target 11. Target 8, which is more focusing on nutrition, food security, livelihoods, while target 11 is more about like a green-blue spaces and human health and reduction on greenhouse gases. So that's why we believe that nature-based solutions should be included more broadly into this framework. But also because nature-based solutions can be seen as an overarching concept, supporting also communication, and we can communications that in this way we can bring these different sectors. We can talk a same language that we can all understand. But also, nature-based solutions can be seen as a potential tool for bringing this dialogue. And that's why the Partnership for Disaster Risk Reduction, together with the Friends of Ecosystem-Based Adaptation, we have been working for this past year in developing a paper that brings clarity about the terminology, because this is important terms. This is very important because we need to know what is the language that we are speaking, and also to be able to mainstream this kind of concept into such global framework. So this is what we have been trying to do in this document. Next slide. And then in this document also, what we have done is to go through the zero draft. I have to say that this version of the paper that you are seeing here is the latest version, because now we are working again into the new version, and also bearing in mind that all the meetings that will happen early in January in Geneva. So with this paper, what we have done is to see like, what is the different targets? So where we could include, for example, nature-based solutions, whether it is in the form of ecosystem-based approaches or nature-based solutions as such. So as we see here, we have been including all the targets and the different also societal challenges that we could address by using nature-based solutions. But also what is important as such. So because with the different indicators, what we can do is like to really be more in detail and go more in depth to have a more target approach in achieving those targets. But also what we really believe is by doing so, we can align the different targets with other frameworks, which means this is a real opportunity. If we work on nature-based solutions, we can have an opportunity in aligning the different agendas. We can align the different agendas, which means that we can, I have to apologize because someone is sending me messages. Thank you. I'm sorry for this. So we can align the different agendas, and by aligning the different agendas, one of the major benefits is that we are avoiding the double counting. Countries, they will just need to go through a specific type of project, and then they can use this type of project to report to different frameworks or different conventions, which is something that countries, they spend so much time in doing back their reporting. So this is one of the major opportunities. But what is another opportunity? Like really making a real impact and really showing that by implementing nature-based solutions, we can bring together society and nature. And I hope it has been clear. And then I'm here for you for any question that you may have.
Thank you, Veronica. A great overview for me as well. These global policy agreements are hard to follow. It's a full-time job, as some of you have as policy officers. So great to have that that global overview there. So next up, before we take questions, we're going to hear from, let me call him up, Philip Lahea Walter, and I hope I made that the pronunciation there. As a Germanic speaking background, it's and Spanish colleagues, it can be, pronunciation always gets a mix for me. So Philip Lahea Walter is a part of Iucn, which we heard from this morning from Holger. So Iucn represents cities across the world, local governance specifically for sustainability. And Philip, your expertise then is in sustainable resources, climate, and resilience. And also of note for the audience is that Philip is part of a Europe Horizon 2020 project called Connecting Nature, which admittedly is one of my favorite H2020 projects. I love the communications I see there. The name is great because that's more of what we need, right? Connecting nature between different sectors. But today we're going to specifically hear a little bit more about what projects can actually do and what different sorts of policies already been ongoing. So Philip, take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Daisy. And I'm wearing many hats here at Iucn, as most of us probably do here. And Connecting Nature is one. Clever Cities is another project that I'm pretty active in. And I'm kind of the point person here for our office here when it comes to biodiversity advocacy on a European, but also on a global level. So, and in that capacity, I've been involved in the Edinboro process, and that's what I want to shed a little bit light on, because it was a pretty unique process that made it possible for subnational and local governments to make their voice heard when it comes to ecosystem restoration, but also when it comes to biodiversity action. So the Edinboro process really has its start in COP14, CBD COP14, and it where the parties called for a comprehensive and participatory process for the preparation of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which we just heard about from Veronica. And parallel to COP14, the 6th Global Biodiversity Summit of local and subnational governments adopted the Sharm el-Sheikh communique, which expands which commits to expand strengthening and raising the ambition of NBS implementation and upscaling through existing projects and initiatives. And it goes on to mention EU-funded NBS projects like Clever Cities, Pro-G-IREC, Naturvation, Connecting Nature, and other projects. So we have already very early on this push for local level through NBS, and this push to give a stronger role to subnational and local governments. Then the Scottish government stepped up and is now leading the Edinboro process as an online global engagement and consultation process. And it includes the main partners such as us, Iucn, European Committee of the Regions, governments of Wales and Quebec, Regions 4, and the group of leading subnational governments towards the Aichi biodiversity targets. The consultation process reviewed the first plan of action, which has been endorsed by CBD COP10. That was for the past decade, and also gave subnational and local governments the opportunity to provide input on their views of how the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework should look like. And the outcomes of the consultation, including an Edinboro Declaration, were then circulated with the parties to the convention just a few weeks ago. Now, what does the declaration include? It stresses the fact that subnationals, including cities, have a vital role in the implementation and mainstreaming of biodiversity, particularly as up to 2/3 of biodiversity legislation is adopted and enacted at the subnational and local level in some parts of the world. And the role of subnational governments need to be clearly recognized as an integral part in implementing the framework. So it really highlights and advocates for a whole of government approach. And then the declaration calls on state parties to take strong and bold actions, to recognize the role of subnational governments, to support the adoption of a dedicated decision to endorse a new plan of action for subnational governments. Since the last plan of action ran out in 2020, now it's time for a new plan of action. And the Edinboro process created a draft for how such an stepped up plan of action could look like. And it also calls for a multi-stakeholder platform to ensure representation of subnational governments. And then the declaration also sets out 10 commitments from subnationals, which also include strengthening capacity building in order to implement nature-based solutions and green and blue infrastructure, particularly through ecosystem-based approaches and as a contribution to a green recovery from COVID-19. Now, coming back to the European level, as a key component, and we heard that before, of the Green Deal, the EU released the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. And as the key policy to translate the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework into European action. And then in this strategy, the biodiversity strategy, it sets out the urban greening plans as the key mechanism to upscale and mainstream NBS for biodiversity action in urban areas, calling for all cities with more than 20,000 inhabitants to create an urban greening plan. ICLEI, in collaboration with Eurocities, is tasked to conduct a consultation process with the European cities and draft guidance materials to support municipalities in implementing such urban greening plans. All right, that was a lot of content squeezed into a few minutes. I hope that gave you a little bit of an overview of what the urban greening plans are, where it came from, and how NBS also are connected to the Edinboro process.
Great, thank you, Philip. Yeah, no, I think from this morning plenary, one of the questions was, how can cities take a leading role on this? And too often when we hear the words COP or Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we always think of countries or even groups of countries. So it's so important to realize that subnational role that not just cities, but any kind of framework like that play. And how they can, even if a government or a country isn't perhaps being as cooperative on certain things or is leading a certain path, a city can still make good progress as part of especially a group. So a very important process there. And before we move on to our last panelist, two things. One is a question for Philip, but I also wanted to highlight what Dave's written from Manchester City. Dave Barlow, he's just written, the City of Manchester has just signed the Edinboro Declaration. So very, very timely presentation from you, Philip. Yeah, you're right. It was a lot of information. And so to bring it down a little bit sort of to earth, specifically for our participants in the room, how do we tie current and future projects to really creating that real policy impact?
Yeah, first of all, really glad to hear this about Manchester. We're inching towards 200 signatories of the Edinboro Declaration, and every additional signature gives this document more weight and will contribute to subnational local governments really having a strong role in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So thanks so much, Dave, for your work towards this. Regarding your question, so I think that the Edinboro Declaration and the proposed update for the plan of action provide a framework for the role of NBS and for how NBS projects can contribute to the upscaling and mainstreaming of NBS for biodiversity action. They call for integrating subnational and local governments in the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. At the moment, there's a disconnect between local and regional biodiversity strategies and action plans. So, you know, there's national targets, but these national targets are not broken down and not connected to local monitoring that is going on in, you know, on subnational level. So there's a clear gap there that needs to be closed. Then vertical harmonization and mainstreaming in general. There's a forthcoming biodiversity governance framework, which has been announced in the EU Biodiversity Strategy. Here, we think that a whole of government approach needs to be taken in this biodiversity governance framework. Landscape scales approaches are really important, like the local Green Deal concept can really make sure that different sectors, different, you know, the rural areas, peri-urban and urban areas can work together to reach goals. And NBS projects can really make, you know, they can pilot these new innovative concepts and really show that they work and provide very important lessons learned in that respect. Other things that are called for in the declaration is, you know, capacity development, both of municipal actors through governance innovations and of the civil society through social innovations. Also there, we have already a lot of really important contributions by NBS projects. However, there's still a lot of work to do. Resource mobilization is a constant topic and a big challenge when it comes to NBS. There is already great work coming out of projects like Connecting Nature and Clever Cities, for example, when it comes to developing innovative business models, innovative financing models. So this is, you know, these are clear areas and challenges that NBS projects can make a big contribution when it comes to, you know, really harnessing the potential that is in NBS for biodiversity action. Just to name a few. I know we're limited in time.
Thank you, Philip. We used to, we could talk and talk and talk for all the different projects, and there is a mapping coming out from NetworkNature, and part of Biodiverse's work also mapping all this research landscape. Okay, so we move on to our final guest, which is Karen Houndberger. There's my Germanic accent coming out, Austrian actually. So we're very happy to have Karen coming in this position, because we've just, you know, Philip just touched upon the European policy side, and Karen is here from the European Commission for the Directorate General on the Environment. She's been passionate about various aspects of how we can use nature, and has attended quite a few, it says in your bio, quite a few different COPs, both for CVD and UNFCCC. So we're here to learn from some of your wisdom, Karen, tying it back to that sort of more specific European vision on including nature-based solutions and policy. And then I'll ask one question before we move on to our breakout room assignment, which is assigning nature-based solutions to different theory, the theory of change of the Global 20 framework. So Karen, yeah, what's happening specifically in Europe, and yeah, just a general statement from yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me here. Indeed, I've been trying throughout my professional career to kind of cover both arenas, climate and biodiversity, which has not always been easy, because as we know, in many spheres, I mean, these conventions have really rather developed in parallel. Now, thanks to or through implementation, scaling up nature-based solutions, maybe there is a chance to bring them together as in order to address the interdependent emergencies of biodiversity and climate change. There's actually no other way. We need to address them in an integrated manner, and that has finally been recognized also in the frame of the UNFCCC. The CBD has been working on the biodiversity climate change nexus actually throughout, really steadily throughout its existence, but the collaboration, I mean, the collaboration between the conventions, in spite of all appeals of synergy, I mean, there's still, let's say, room for improvement. Now, EU's role in that, EU is, and member states, parties to both, so they really have a strong, high responsibility and also a strong role to play to make it happen. You've already touched upon the European Green Deal, which obviously is our roadmap for having this transformative change happening. And I mean, for those of you in the audience a bit older, they might realize how much of a change this actually is for European policy. I mean, from jobs and growth of the previous Commission to the European Green Deal, this is really quite a radical change, a super radical change actually. And now in the follow-up of the European Green Deal, there has been this ribambelle of strategies which have already been mentioned, the Biodiversity Strategy, Adaptation Strategy, the zero pollution, the circular economy. And in a way, when it comes, all these strategies are wonderful, but they will only, I mean, the implementation is what counts. The action is what counts. And as we are in this planetary emergency, so it's really, we will, I mean, failure or success will be defined through how much we manage to implement those strategies. And here, I mean, again, I like to be honest. We have spoken a lot about breaking down the silos, and that there's a lot of institutional, I call it institutional inertia, which is sometimes not making it easy. And it's also the challenge of the challenge and the big potential of nature-based solutions in my view, because in order for nature-based solutions to work well, you actually need this interdisciplinarity. You need this different experience and different knowledge to work together. It's the collaboration, the collaborative aspect that, I mean, really comes out through successful nature-based solutions. I would also still like to make a note of just alert, because we also pointed to the Global Biodiversity Framework that is still in the negotiation. I mean, COVID has kind of derailed all these international negotiations, and we are still struggling with that. And actually, when it comes to nature-based solutions and the Global Biodiversity Framework, there's in the negotiation room, there's still parties and also NGOs who are literally opposed against mentioning using the term nature-based solutions in the text. So there's still, I mean, convincing to make clear what nature-based solutions are and what they are not. So there's still a gray zone. I mean, there are still parties who raise their voice and say nature-based solutions is a vague concept. And I mean, from all your work and all the work, the work of scientists and practitioners over more than a decade, I mean, there's difficulties with nature-based solutions, but it's not a vague concept. It's still in the negotiation space. I mean, I would also go as far as saying that really we have to see and to face that there are not all parties are negotiating in good faith. There are different agendas behind, that's for sure, because nature-based solutions has been kind of calm up until the Climate Action Summit in 2019, which really brought it to the forefront. And now now that there are these voices who say that CBD should stay away from nature-based solutions, that's really, it's counterproductive. And what can you, I think, as practitioners, researchers do to help here is really just be very assertive and really loud about what nature-based solutions are and where the potentials are. From EU side, I mean, we really try to do our best. I mean, we have nature-based solutions strongly referred to in the strategies. There is a definition for nature-based solutions, very much aligned with also the definition of Iucn, goes a little bit further, also looks at the inspired by nature and puts in the resilience aspect, but really the heart is there, that nature-based solutions are positive for biodiversity and deliver multiple benefits. Now here, I do think there are forces who would really see nature-based solutions, and also you could perhaps say that plantations are nature-based solutions, which of course is not the case if you look at the EU's definition and the Iucn definitions. But we don't have an internationally agreed definition on nature-based solutions yet. We hope there's in the upcoming UNEA meeting, in the second part of it, I mean, there might hopefully will be a resolution on nature-based solutions, which will help to solve this, because this is really a stumbling stone in the negotiation, and more precisely in the negotiation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Personally, I really think nature-based solutions, I mean, must be part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, but at this point in time, I don't know how closely you follow the evolution of the text. It was there in the zero draft, but because of this opposition of a number of parties, I mean, it was not back in the first draft, it was taken out. Then there were now a number of voices in favor, and now here we are. We'll have the next negotiation meetings coming up in January, so it's still the ball is still in the open. I'm looking forward for any questions you might have.
Thank you, Karen. And that gives me some hope, because it is very late. It's nearly too late for any inclusion of nature-based solutions, but there are still opportunities coming up in this second part two. So before, we don't really have questions from the audience, and we don't have time because we do need to send them to their group work. But before they do, if you could just quickly, in one sentence, if anybody who's going to follow part two of CBD COP15, what's one thing they should really keep an eye out for? One thing they should follow, either a country or a topic, and then we'll move on to some group work.
Well, just as I said, I would really follow closely the discussions of goals A and B. These are the ones where, I mean, the link to climate in general and nature-based solutions in particular are addressed. And it would really help having assertive voices on being clear what nature-based solutions are, and also being very clear on what nature-based solutions are not. And most importantly, make sure that, I mean, in CBD, we have used the term ecosystem-based approaches. I mean, they're not perfectly synonymous, but they really share the same root. And I mean, what to say is that principles and safeguards that have been adopted for ecosystem-based approaches during the last COP of CBD are valid also for nature-based solutions. This should be our starting point. They can be improved, of course, but this is the starting point, because then, I mean, we don't have these violations of human rights, and we don't have that nature-based solutions cause biodiversity loss, because these are not nature-based solutions. And I mean, then this would be, I think this needs to be made clear. And if you can make it clear in conversations, exchanges you might have, I think this would be really helpful. Have a strong community that is really assertive. I mean, there are unknowns we still have to learn. There are also things that do not work, but I mean, over and over, I think the benefits, I mean, just outweigh by far the losses.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karen. And I want to take this opportunity just to thank the three of you. I think we can end with that call to action of, we can be the assertive voices on nature-based solution and build those strong cores of practice, while admitting that there's still things we don't know. I'd love to take this panel forward. I'd love to take all the questions and have you all in the same room to discuss over coffee, but we're going to have to move on to the last bit of breakout room. So thank you very much to the three of you. So to the rest of the audience who've been listening avidly, we're about to send you into the same breakout rooms. You're going to use the same mural board that you did before. But in this case, we're going to look at from the latest iteration of the Post-2020 framework. Here is the theory of change, looking at the current status, looking at the vision of living in harmony with nature, and these different steps. So the mission of the framework and the milestones and goals that they want to reach. So what you're going to do in the mural is there are green sticky notes for the enablers, and there are red sticky notes for any barriers to this theory of change when it comes to nature-based solutions. So we should get a nice annotated theory of change. So if you go to the mural in your groups and you just drag those sticky notes to say, here, there's an opportunity for nature-based solutions, maybe you can make it specifically to saying, making, the contribution of cities visible, or perhaps this is, we need more assessments on agricultural land, but it could also be barriers where maybe ignorance or misidentification of nature-based solutions could actually stop a milestone or hinder part of the mission. There's a little bit of an experimental exercise. It's something that we've been trying to do internally. So please, take risks, put things down. Even if you just get one of each down, that would be great. So I'm going to send you into your breakout rooms now. and we will see you in just under 15 minutes. Wonderful. Okay, so just a couple more minutes of closing. We had hoped to do a closing Menti, but we have run a little bit over time. I wanted to sincerely thank you all for the effort that you've put into this, and in these quite short breakout rooms, what you've managed to achieve, because it's really in communicating to people who work on the post-2020 framework, where nature-based solutions, not just what they are and telling them, yes, they need to be acknowledged, and this is how they compare to ecosystem-based approaches, how they're an umbrella term that gather all these approaches under one. And this is how they're defined, but that's not quite enough, because so what? You know, okay, fine, we need to recognize, but what are the benefits and what could we lose out on? What are the risks? And one of the things I really like here is that it's both a barrier and an enabler, the perception of nature, which I think is a really wonderful way of saying how we work with nature. And I do see some barriers in terms of, and we saw that in the morning plenary, in terms of financing and inertia, specifically in the engineering sector. So that's a sector we really need to work with, is the finance and investment sector. And we have quite a few then between the mission. What's interesting is to see so many barriers to mission and milestones, because you'd think that, you know, if everything was good and proper, that between the mission and milestones, there shouldn't be these barriers. But key there is, if nature-based solutions are misused, then the best mission in the world could result in not meeting those milestones. So we need to recognize that platform, include minorities as well, and professional liability also creating a barrier. So I think that's a really a thing I'll take forward when communicating on post-2020 framework, is that, you know, the mission is very solid, and of course everyone knows there are barriers such as financing, but if we want that mission to really be able to achieve its goals, not taking into account nature-based solutions and the associated parts form a real risk to not being able to reach the goals. And the opportunities then are provided by nature-based solutions in highlighting traditional practices and already things that are already happening, especially with indigenous peoples, by learning from different communities, such as youth, and promotion of the IUCN global standard for nature-based solutions. We will be able to reach these targets. And for those targets to then translate really into living in harmony with nature, we need those successful examples of NBS implementation, examples of that inclusive governance coming back to people's involvement, indigenous peoples, locals, community. And I personally really like the inclusion of environmental art. Yesterday, we were talking to a new pilot, a new assessment with the nature-based solutions to a coastal engineering project in the Netherlands. And one of the things he pointed out that our standard didn't quite capture was how love of nature, people's love of their local environment, it was a powerful moving force when it came to engaging people, stakeholders, and even funds. So I know maybe a bit of a corny note to end on, but I want to leave you with that within all these frameworks and technicalities and titles and policies, at its heart is the fact that many of us, and in fact, I think all of us on some level, love the nature we work on, and that really motivates us together to achieve that vision of the post-2020 framework. Okay, and with that slightly corny note, we're going to close. I'd like to thank all of you, our panelists. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Linda Lunghaho, who's my colleague in Nairobi, who's been taking the reporting notes on this and communicating as well the message learned to our the facilitator for the plenary. In the chat, as a reminder, I'm also going to post the link to this afternoon's plenary. So for any of you joining us for the closing, we have some great panels with the same facilitator, Anna Jones, who's really good at getting people together to have a real interactive panel. And I believe that's all. So if we could maybe just turn on our videos if you're comfortable, just to show our human selves, and then we can say goodbye. And David Benjamin, I see your design competition with students. I'd love to hear more about that. We had that question about education this morning, so please do get in touch with me at daisy.hessenberger@iucn.org. Thank you, everyone. It's really, been lovely getting to know you all, and feel free to unmute and say goodbye in your own language or way. that you'd like to. Dave, I love art in the background, those pictures.
Oh, thanks very much. Have a great day, everyone.
Have a great day. Bye. Bye, Shreya.
Bye.
Bye, Julia.
Thanks, Daisy.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.